So this is another replay of the same failed strategy. And how many regime change operations do we have to run before somebody finally figures out this doesn't work? So truth is in short supply.
Well, it's hard to refute that. Colonel Macgregor recently went on Rachel Blevin's podcast and talked about the effects of war propaganda, how the truth is always the first casualty in war, and why U.S. involvement in the Israel strike against Iran is a bad idea. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
As you see it right now, is the U.S. at war with Iran, even just with all of the support it's providing to Israel?
Yes, just as we are a co-belligerent in Ukraine, we have from the very beginning been a co-belligerent in the war with Iran that Israel has started. No question about it.
Yeah, and when it comes to how involved the U.S. is going to get, right? I know that that's a major concern right now as we've watched some of Trump's commentary on social media in particular. What are your concerns about where that stands and what that could mean for the American people going into this?
Well, we are committed to action against Iran. It's not a question of if that will happen, but when that will happen. I think there has been a slight delay in order to assemble forces, air and naval, because that's effectively what President Trump is pinning his hopes on, American air and naval power. Now, understand that we have three branches of government in the United States. One is the media, the mainstream media. They are 100% in Israel's pocket. Then you have Congress and the White House. They are 100% in Israel's pocket. And then finally, you have the military-industrial sector led by the retired and active four stars and their shareholders. They are 100% in Israel's pocket. So there is no debate about what will happen. We're going to launch, I would imagine, airstrikes involving primarily B-2, B-1 bombers, delivering very, very devastating, precise munitions, ostensibly to destroy the underground facilities that the Iranians have, and also, I think, to pursue this illusory regime change approach.
Yeah, I can't disagree with Colonel Macgregor, although I wish we were both wrong about this. It really seems like the U.S. is posturing to play a more direct role in this war. They've already given Israel interceptor missiles. The Iron Dome has turned out to be a sieve in some cases, as he said in a different podcast. We've bankrolled Israel from the start. They're using our military intelligence, and there's recent indications that the U.S. is moving naval resources from other places around the globe into that region. That can only mean one thing, and our troops are going to be endangered. And I don't think Iran is going to strike our troops, but they are within retaliation distance if the U.S. strikes, which if it happens, they could be sitting ducks. And that's a big problem. That would draw the U.S. into war completely if this was a false flag. Israel has every incentive under the sun to drag the U.S. in. So that's my biggest apprehension at the moment, that there's some strike against, naval vessels. But I have to agree with Macgregor here.
And we'll kill more people in Tehran and other places that we think are going to be, essential parts of the national leadership. The problem with all of this is air and naval power does not win wars. It never has. Secondly, it's assuming that Iran is weak and already in a state of disarray. The opposite is the case. Israel is in very serious trouble. They embarked on this war without understanding what they were doing. And I think Ben-Gvir said that by accident in public when he mentioned, we didn't appreciate the power of the Iranian missile arsenal. Well, that's an understatement. They can't stop much of anything. Iron Dome has turned out to be a sieve. Iron Dome, that is. And we're not going to be able to do as much damage as we think. I think the integrated air defenses will have an impact. Can they prevent everything from getting through? No, that's impossible. But I think it's going to retard the effort that we're about to undertake. The other thing is we have over 40,000 troops on the ground in the region. I imagine that once we attack, the Iranians will feel obligated to attack those targets. So we could lose a lot of people. We don't have the air defense network in place to stop much of it.
And despite the loss of people, too, just that notwithstanding, I should say, they can also shut down a lot of the supply and production and movement, the logistics of the global natural gas and oil supply out of the Suez Canal, out of that region. And Americans might pay the price even if they don't directly from this. They will in terms of inflation, rising prices. If there's a energy crisis again, which has happened several other times during Middle Eastern wars, and the U.S. might get sucked into this perilous regime change operation like it always has in the past, like it did in Syria and Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan, and all these senseless wars that the U.S. stays and occupies. I'm so dreading the prospect of that happening. We really might see Iraq 2.0, but in a worse situation, because Iran is far more advanced in terms of technology and weaponry than Iraq was at that point relative to the times in which the U.S. invaded. So, yes, this is a bad idea. The U.S. is going down the wrong path, and it seems as if Netanyahu undermined what were ostensibly, or at least according to all appearances, U.S. foreign policy goals, which was to negotiate with the Iranians. But no, this was a timed attack so that that pretext for war could not remain, to stop the pretext for war. So if there was a new JCPOA, which curtailed Iran's nuclear program, they wouldn't be able to drum up the war propaganda they are now to support it, even though Mossad, MI6, and the CIA all deny that Iran has nuclear weapons. Tulsi Gabbard confirmed that.
Our air defenses have always been woefully behind the rest of the armed forces in terms of their development and investment. When I was in the Army, where you have much of your ground-based air defense, we always used to refer to them as the red-headed stepchildren. They never had enough. But we, on the other hand, had never really faced an enemy that had tremendous missile and air power. And Iran definitely has that. So I think we're at the beginning of a long war. There will be no sudden surrender by the Iranians to Donald Trump, no matter what he's being told. And I think he's very foolish to believe any of the people talking to him, because these are the same people that urged us to become involved in Ukraine and sponsor the Ukrainian battering ram against Russia, telling us all back in February of 2022, March, April, May, June, July, and onward, oh, the Russians are incompetent. The Russians are running out of ammunition. The Russians don't have enough missiles. The Russian soldiers don't want to fight, on and on and on. Well, that was all nonsense.
Yeah, also nonsense is this talk of the Iranians rising up and overthrowing their government after Israel struck them. Well, if Israel is the existential enemy of Iran, like so many of the neocon hawks and Zionists tell us that, death to Israel, they want to destroy Israel, they've constantly wanted it for so long. If that's really true, and then Israel attacks them, what's going to make them think that it's the fault of their government, or that that's the opportunity to overthrow the government? No, they view this as an existential crisis to them, a threat to them, that they were preemptively struck by this act of aggression that the U.S. is in on, too, by the way.
Lies. Most of what is being heard in the mainstream media about Iran is also one big lie.
Yeah.
Iran is not about to surrender. It's not going to crumble. There will be no uprising to remove the regime. So fasten your seatbelts and get ready. This is going to go on and on and on until Israel is practically destroyed. Then the question is, will the Israelis turn to a nuclear weapon? That, of course, is the last thing in the world they should do, simply because if they do use a nuclear weapon at some point in desperation, others in the region will suddenly produce nuclear weapons that will be used against them.
Yeah, I hate to say I agree there too. And, a lot of people are not talking about this angle, but Pakistan has nukes too. And the thought and possibility of Pakistan supplying nukes to a fellow Muslim nation is extremely concerning if Israel uses it. This is serious stuff here, and I don't think that our politicians are taking it seriously to be so flippant about, oh, hey, we're just providing a support role for this thing. When this is tying the U.S. to foreign policy objectives that Netanyahu has wanted forever, that is designed to take eyes off what he's doing in Gaza, and will further tensions with Russia, because Iran is a Russia ally, it's a BRICS country, and if you want to establish peace in Ukraine, this is the last thing you should do. It's tanking the prospect of any other party around the world trusting the United States and its diplomacy. This is the most twisted diplomacy you could possibly ever have, is pretending to have negotiations only to lull Iran into a false sense of security like they're not going to be struck, and then being in on the strike with Netanyahu. It's crazy.
And of course, that is a Pandora's box that no one in their right mind should want to open. But I don't think any of this is being carefully considered.
Yeah, and that is a major concern, right? Because when I'm hearing Israel's defense minister saying Tehran will burn, I'm wanting to know, okay, what does he have in store? What is he thinking about? And I know that that's something that you've been really highlighting when it comes to the US is that we, well, as a country, don't necessarily look at future planning, right? Long term, what are our goals here? Instead, we're just running into this war. And exactly as you were noting, the expectation that Iran is just magically going to crumble, we're not seeing any actual evidence of that. So, what does that mean for where the US stands and really how much it's willing to get involved here? Because some of the statements we're seeing from Trump, it's clear that he's getting very frustrated, right? When he's tweeting out unconditional surrender, or he's calling for the evacuation immediately of Tehran, a city of around 10 million people. But beyond that, I'm also wondering, okay, what does this mean for what the US is willing to get into, especially when it comes to a president who campaigns so heavily on this promise of no new wars?
Well, whatever he campaigned for, remember, he's entirely beholden to his real masters, who are the people that provided him with the money to seize the White House.
Yeah.
And we know who they are. That is the class of billionaires like the Adelsons and others.
Yeah.
And the Jewish billionaires that fund the lobby and helped him to gain the White House now want to be repaid in kind.
Yeah, that's how American politics works. It's sad. This mystical illusion that it exists to represent you is not exactly true. It's there to represent the most powerful allies in terms of corporate donors and lobbies in existence. And one of the most powerful is AIPAC. And AIPAC is tied at the hip to Trump. Miriam Adelson is tied to the hip to Trump. Trump's openly boasted about how he's the most pro-Israel president. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. There's few things that Trump hasn't done to back the Israelis, basically brushing off any criticism of what's going on in Gaza, even if behind the scenes he's not exactly happy about that. He was even willing to allow Netanyahu to break the ceasefire that he orchestrated as he walked into office, which was one of the best things he's done so far. It didn't last long, but it was beneficial for some time. So Macgregor's on fire here. These are some red-pilled takes, and he's exactly right.
So I don't think he has much choice. What he's done, though, is that he's listened, as I pointed out before, to the same poisonous voices that took us into Ukraine, that created this terrible monster in Ukraine and then created the war that followed, that we have lost, that the Ukrainians have lost. Now, for some reason, he's allowed these people to convince him that we can walk in, bully, and pulverize our way to success in Iran. I think a part of him likes to bully. He certainly thinks bullying tactics work, and I think it's based on his business experience.
Yeah,
but sure. Ultimately, I think it's a serious mistake, and it's not going to work. And the question is going to be, all right, we've done this for X number of days. We've committed all these aircraft, all these missiles, all these weapons. Now what? The absence of strategy results in you arriving in a place like Stalingrad or Quang Tri in Vietnam in 1968 or 69. And then you say, where am I? What am I doing? What's the point? What are we achieving? He's not asking those questions, and he shouldn't be listening to the people that are talking to him, to be perfectly blunt.
Yeah, I agree with them. Keith Kellogg and Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham especially. He made it a point to endorse Lindsey Graham and to drag actual non-interventionists like Thomas Massey over other issues. And Keith Kellogg even being involved in the diplomatic parties that Trump is assembling is just madness. Marco Rubio doesn't help either. I almost said Ricky Rubio, the point guard in the NBA. Marco Rubio doesn't help either. He's long been a huge pro-Israel Zionist, pro-war neocon, and even supported the Ukraine war at one time. So he's not surrounding himself with the right people to establish peace. And we know we would be unrealistic if we expected his cabinet not to be filled with Zionists based on who was funding him. But there are some more non-interventionist style Zionists like Steve Witkoff that have not, been able to move Trump in the other direction to any regard. And I say that relatively compared to other ones like Mike Huckabee, who is pretty much the most hardcore Zionist I've ever seen in our government.
But again, he has to rationalize it based on the campaign contributions and what he owes those who helped him gain the White House. It's going to fail. This is not going to work. And then the question is, how much further do you go? I don't think we can afford to go much further. And if you look right now at the price of oil, what is it, $75 a barrel? I expect that the Iranians will prevent anyone from moving through the straits unless they authorize it. They've essentially published an order saying if you're not authorized to go through these straits, face the consequences. We'll stop you or sink you. Are we going to sail most of the U.S. Army into the Persian Gulf? I don't think so. Most of the U.S. Navy. But I think we're going to sit offshore. We're going to hurl bombs and missiles at people. Historically, it doesn't make much difference. I mean, I watched this back in 1981 and 82 in Lebanon. We had a battleship at that point that was lobbing 16-inch rounds. Nobody ashore really cared. It didn't make any difference. Didn't change anything. Ultimately, we lost all these Marines in that barracks, stupidly, pointlessly, in a place where they had no business being and accomplished nothing. Ronald Reagan, wised up quickly and said, "We're out," and left. Smart.
Right, and they called him weak for doing that, by the way. Neocon hawks that were much more neocon and interventionist than Reagan himself mocked him and ridiculed for that. Some called for expanded military presence in Beirut and Lebanon, in the Middle East in general, because of that. But he made the right decision there, and hey, I'm pretty critical of Reagan on certain things, but he was willing to do that and negotiate with the Soviets, with Gorbachev, the head of the country he called the evil empire. So Macgregor's right here. Shutting off shipment of oil and natural gas through the Strait of Hormuz would be disastrous, and Iran clearly has the capacity to do that, and they've already threatened to do that. I think they threatened to do that just yesterday.
Move. He got out. He didn't want to be dragged into this morass. But we're not led by Ronald Reagan. He may not have been brilliant, but he was rational. I don't think we're being led by rational people. I think it's a combination of arrogance, wishful thinking, and self-delusion. So we're on a bad path. Now, when will people pay attention to this? When the gas costs $7 a gallon. When the supply chains break down, when you can't get something to eat, when you can't do whatever it is that you want to do. That's when Americans will become interested. Now, what happens across our country? Well, we've got a lot of problems. I saw lots of Mexican and other foreign flags being flown in Los Angeles. I don't see any U.S. or Israeli flags being flown in Tehran. I think Iran is far more cohesive socially than the United States right now. So under those circumstances, I think we're on a very dangerous path. But no one's listening. It's back to those three branches of government. But when things get bad, the American people are hurting, then we'll pay attention.
Yeah, that's right. The typical American does largely disregard foreign policy for the most part, but it's so intertwined with our daily lives, regardless of how much the typical American cares about it, because it's the source of so much debt, so many animosities overseas that compound over time and draw us into these crazy entangling alliances, often to the supposed benefit of Israel, even though often I believe that it threatens Israel, our relationship with them, because of how they act, because they know America is always at their back. They're always there to catch their back, so to speak, regardless of what they want to do. And these disasters cause inflation and debt and the curtailment of civil liberties. We saw that during the first Bush administration. That's when the Patriot Act came through. That's when the DHS was created. That's when the TSA was created. That's when the surveillance state was really expanded to the point that it was at the time of the Snowden revelations. So Macgregor is so right here.
All of a sudden, when you start looking at gas prices and you're like, wait a second, why are we at war with Iran? Which is always interesting when it comes to the messaging there. I know that there have been some parallels drawn to the lead up to the war in Iraq, right? Looking at weapons of mass destruction. Now you have Trump in this position where he keeps using this phrase, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Yet he then turned around and told reporters that he does not care about the testimony from his own director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who told
Yeah.
Congress back in March that the US has no evidence that Iran is creating a nuclear weapon. We now have CNN admitting in a recent report that, according to their sources in the intelligence community, not only is Iran not actively pursuing a nuclear weapon, but it would still be years away from being able to target anyone with one. So, what does that tell us about the logic here? They keep repeating this nuclear weapon phrase while you have Iran over here saying, hey, we wanted to make a deal with you, right? Iran's supreme leader today saying we were not posing any kind of military threat while we were in these talks.
The Russians never had any plans to march west and conquer Eastern Europe. The Russians are not looking
Yep.
for a war with NATO. What difference does that make? It makes no difference at all if you're perpetrating a lie. And that's what we've been doing. We've been saying, oh no, these Russians are evil. They want to conquer everything, subjugate everybody. Well, the same people are making the same argument now about Iran.
Yeah.
Truth does not matter. What matters is whether or not people in the United States feel the pain. Now, here's one other aspect of this thing that we need to take into consideration. Our borders have been open. We have millions and millions of people inside this country about whom we know nothing. And we know that corruption, criminality, terrorism, all of those things blend nicely. What could happen inside our country? You could wake up tomorrow morning and find out that a mall in Seattle was blown up and killed several hundred people. You could find out that someone placed a low yield nuclear weapon in proximity to Washington. We have no way of knowing. Now, people say, oh, well, they could never do that. How many times have we heard that something like that could never happen, only to discover that it has happened?
Yeah, I largely agree with Macgregor here, especially on the point where he talked about how truth doesn't matter in terms of the war machine narrative. Only the war machine narrative prevails. They can repeat it as many times as possible, and whether or not it's true is not really the point. We can debate endlessly whether it's true, and I certainly will. I think there is, real strength and real purpose behind revealing the truth. But if the regime can get a lot of people convinced in the untruth, the anti-truth, the non-truth, they can sell wars. We saw that with Iraq. We've seen that so many times in the past, and they always use the same schemes to liken any dissidents, people that dare oppose it, to be secret collaborators with the enemy. You're pro-Ayatollah, you're pro-Putin, you're a KGB agent, all this stuff it's just so ridiculous, and some people still buy into it. So he's right about the truth and the narratives that support war.
I hope it doesn't come to those things. But nobody is thinking through this thing very clearly. When I wrote the piece that was published in Zero Hedge about how to achieve peace and argued for convening a great power peace conference and going to the United Nations asking for an immediate ceasefire and telling the Israelis that we would not supply them any further as long as they were murdering people in Gaza, that had to stop immediately. Why? I wrote all of those things because you have to have a conference involving the United States, Russia, China, India, and I would argue Brazil as a great power in Latin America. And I would say they have to sit there and arbitrate these disputes and end all of this.
Even threatening to withhold aid to Israel would move mountains, that's for sure.
Well, that would mean that Israel would be compelled to behave like a normal state in the region. And that's unacceptable to Israel. Therefore, it's unacceptable to us. This is a war about not just Israel's regional hegemony, which it is. It's also about financial hegemony in the hands of the United States, directed from New York City and the banks of Great Britain and the city of London. They failed to rip apart Russia, failed to destroy the state, failed to create chaos, and failed to exploit the resources. Now they've turned their attention to the Middle East. What do they want? They want the oil fields. They want to control the region. They have a terrible obstacle in their path right now. It's called Iran. The Iranians have said, no, we are a great civilizational power. We are not going to surrender. We will not turn our country over to you any more than the Russians would turn Russia over to the same financial interests in the West.
And they always argue that this time it'll be different. This war is going to be unlike the ones in the past. It's going to be quick, easy, efficient, and no American bloodshed will have to happen. It's going to be a targeted strike, right? That always preempts some of the most disastrous military excursions in the world. One example that immediately comes to mind is Libya, where they established and enforced a no-fly zone, and then the U.S. supported rebel groups and under a NATO alliance pushed the regime to the brink, deposed Gaddafi. He died in the most brutal way that I'm not even going to talk about. And then we had Gaddafi's weapons become dispersed throughout sub-Saharan Africa, open slave trade markets, and just complete despair. For what? For nothing. Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons program and was still toppled. So if you're an Iranian, mullah or ayatollah, and you're looking at what the U.S. does, what's your incentive not to have nuclear weapons, especially after the strike? After the strike, you have to believe that the duplicity was real, the U.S. was in on it, Israel orchestrated it, and, why wouldn't you want to acquire a nuke now? This is actually, inspired Iran to want to acquire a nuke now.
So this is another replay of the same failed strategy. And how many regime change operations do we have to run before somebody finally figures out this doesn't work? I don't have the answer, but I can tell you right now, everyone in Washington is rotten to the core when it comes to this business. Why? Because of money. Everyone is greedy. Everyone wants more cash. The retired 4-stars, the active 4-stars, the senators, the congressmen, the president and his entourage in the White House, everything is about money. And the same thing is true for the military-industrial complex, these industries, is true for the media. Everyone is about money. So truth is in short supply.
Man, isn't that the truth? The military-industrial complex thrives off bloodshed, especially prolonged bloodshed, the kind that the U.S. offered in the form of Afghanistan, Iraq, and all these fruitless occupations and regime change operations. Regime changes haven't exactly gone well for the U.S., by the way. I mean, we can go back as far as to Iran, ironically, in 1953, removing Mossadegh because he wanted to nationalize the oil. That pissed off British oil conglomerates like BP. He got in power. There were some more pro-Western attitudes, no doubt about that, for some time. The civilization worked well, but he also implemented a secret police and a surveillance state that curtailed the liberties of his people. It pissed off the fundamentalists, and then they overthrew him in 78 and 79. It culminated in the revolution in 79, deposed him, and then that's the government we want to replace again. So we're just looking back. Our government is like, hey, what happened in the past? This time it's going to be different. This time we're going to replace it with a great regime that Netanyahu, has handpicked or whatever, maybe the Shah's son. Some people are talking about that. Netanyahu has always wanted this regime change. Why? It takes the pretext. It removes the chance that the pretext for invasion would be taken off the table by a negotiation like the JCPOA, which I've said many times was the only great foreign policy decision Obama ever made, as far as I'm concerned. And in doing it, he overrode the will of Netanyahu. So it was a good decision. But I want to hear from what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Are we headed to a full-bore U.S. strike on Iran? Is there any way to disengage from this? Is there any way peace can be the result of this? Or are we already in too deep? Let me know down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron to support the channel and help me out. I'd really appreciate that. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.